Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. We have a terrific episode of Holden's 11. Tonight, my special guest, Jonathan Halley Tang. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hey Tim, thanks for having me. Um, thanks for taking the time out to talk to me about some of the what I think are some of the greatest horror movies ever made.
I can't wait to talk to you. Viewers, we have a terrific topic tonight. And basically, what it is, it's the top 11 Universal monsters. And there's one or two left turns in there too, but we're going to talk about the genre as a whole and particularly focusing on classic early black and white horror. So we'll jump right in to our number 11. This one is from 1943. It's Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. And this is one of the ones they used to call sort of the rally films, what we might call a team up these days. What's your thoughts on the team up movies, Jonathan?
So Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman kicks it off, right? And then we have House of Dracula or House of Frankenstein, then House of Dracula, right?
Right.
And the Wolfman's in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, so that could be a team up too.
Right. There's technically a comedy team up. We got one or two of those on the list too.
But I think it was a novel idea for the time, right? We don't see a lot of I have them all written down here. So let's see. When did it come out? 1943.
Right.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of crossover, right? We don't really see it anywhere except for maybe in comic books. I think All-Star Comics had come out by that time, and World's Finest had already come out.
Right.
So we didn't.
And there was an element too of some of these actors were pretty big together too. That were the time, the Lon Chaney's and the Claude Rains and the Bela Lugosi's.
Oh yeah. Well, so seeing them, in a movie together, which technically this isn't the first time we've seen them together, right? They were all over Universal, in some lesser known Universal movies, right? Like the Edgar Allan Poe Universal movies.
Sure.
Have both Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. But having, Frankenstein and the Wolfman, I don't even think it mattered who played them, right? People would be excited to see them fight.
They were excited, and it was a hit almost right away for the.
Yeah. It kind of saved Universal. I mean, things were not going well.
They were stagnating a little bit, and you're right. It was kind of. You could probably prove that it was the team up films that helped propel them into the 50s, because the Universal era lasted a long time. It was 20 some years, if not 30 years. So, we talked about focusing on the early horror stuff. And I put one on the list, Jonathan, that we were like, man, I don't know. It kind of breaks the rules, which the rules generally had to be black and white, had to be the generally discussed Universal monster. And this one kind of came in the back door because Bela Lugosi was in the film, who was, of course, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, monster actor. But this was 1932's White Zombie. What's your thoughts on that one? Technically not Universal, right?
Not Universal. I actually, who's the studio on that? I love that movie.
Yeah, it's kind of I wouldn't say it's the first zombie movie, but like one of the early classic zombie films that's spooky, and it's got the cool movie poster, and of course, White Zombie being the reference for tons of heavy metal things,
Yeah.
Which that's almost enough right there, right?
So White Zombie was United Artists. And this actually, I hear all these stories about how horrible those contracts were with the old studios. But this was made a year after Dracula. So I guess they didn't have Lugosi in a contract, or, maybe there was, some loan out going on.
And he was in a lot of stuff in those years,
yeah.
Right? He was in a lot of roles.
But White Zombie is, it's creepy. It's very creepy.
Yeah.
And, there is, they're not quite the zombies we know now, right?
Right. It's more to do with like being mind controlled
Yeah, it's
right.
a living
controlling.
death.
Right. Yeah, they're controlling the guy's mind, sort of. And you're right. It was a creepy film, and some of the entries on this list are just plain not too scary. Like we'll talk about the next one.
Oh yeah.
Number 9.
Oh,
this is 1948.
Actually,
go ahead.
Before we go to the next one, I would like to, just for anyone watching that hasn't seen White Zombie,
you got to see it.
Oh yeah, you got to see it. But there's a really bad version of it out, and that's the common version I think most people see. It's like the Alpha Video Kino version, and it's not restored, right? And it's missing a lot of scenes. So avoid that version. There's no full restoration of it, but there are versions that have partial restorations. I mean, and the Kino version, it's missing a lot of context, right? There's a scene where he explains like his army of zombies. He explains who they were before he turned them into zombies, and that's completely missing from the Kino version.
Nice. I'll check that out, man, because I love the early films, and that's where we're headed with this, is we take a lot of inspiration from those early.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So I was mentioning that some of them are not necessarily too scary, but they can still get firmly placed on a list of the Universal monster movies. The next one is 1948, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein.
Yes.
A great movie, right? Like they don't necessarily have to be scary. And I can remember being that age, and in the early reruns, that was how you learned about some of these monsters, was by their interactions with Abbott and Costello, right? And Scooby-Doo too, some of them.
Yeah, a lot of them were on Scooby-Doo. A lot of those old horror movie actors actually reprised their roles on Scooby-Doo. It's kind of astounding how many like good voice actors Scooby-Doo got.
Yeah. By the way, I'm a huge Scooby-Doo fan. Yeah, no rip on Scooby-Doo here.
No, yeah.
That's old school. But you know, you have a kind of a point, right? Like there's cultural touch points for horror, and there tends to be something shaking hands on the comedy end. And in this case, it was Abbott and Costello, who were a big film franchise already.
Oh yeah.
You got to think the guy sitting at the meeting suggesting this, he seems like a genius now, you know, because my point is, it was very original back then.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is the good one.
Yeah, some of them are not too good of movies either.
Yeah. So you have several other there's Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man, Abbott and Costello Meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Yeah. I think, is there a mummy one? I think there might be a mummy.
Yeah, Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy.
Yeah.
And all those are not those seem kind of like the cash grabs from Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And I think the reason that Abbott and Costello movie works is because it's still very much in the framework of the Frankenstein movies, right? The sets are lavish and
they're beautiful.
Yeah, it's a spooky atmosphere. So it's like Abbott and Costello kind of fall into this world, right? It's not so much like, oh, it's Frankenstein in an Abbott and Costello movie. It's Abbott and Costello in a Frankenstein movie. And I think that kind of juxtaposition is what really makes that work. Whereas the later ones feel like they don't really do justice to the genre.
It becomes like a formula they were clicking through. And I will agree with you, Jonathan. I think you're right that it's the absurdity of Abbott and Costello which makes the whole thing work. You know, I was even kind of a fan of their movies too.
Oh yeah, I love Abbott and Costello. Kind of an honorable mention here because we were just talking about White Zombie.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with the movie The Ghost Breakers.
I don't know that one.
That's a really, really good one. It's a Bob Hope movie.
You know what? Yeah, I was going to say, when I said about how original Abbott and Costello was, I almost said with the exception of Bob Hope, because he was doing that kind of stuff. Yeah. And didn't he turn up in some of the monster movie ads and stuff like that?
Oh yeah, and there was tons of like cameos in his movies of these famous actors, Western and horror movie actors. But he had one that was kind of a spoof on zombie movies. And it's similar to the Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein in that it is a zombie movie. It's very spooky the way it's shot. The sets are very lavish and gothic. It's just a zombie movie where occasionally Bob Hope pops in and has like some brilliant one-liner, right? And there's something about that just makes it a lot of fun, right?
Right.
They never break what you love about horror movies. They just add another element to it.
And I love that we can point out some of these movies are so classic. When you talk about standing the test of time,
oh yeah,
right? Like here's one. This is our number 8. This is The Wolfman. It's 1941 that movie came out, and I mean, werewolves are as hot today as they were then.
So an interesting thing actually about the Wolfman, if you're, the fan universal canon, which is kind of arbitrary, right? It's something people decided, like these are the universal monster movies, these 7 monsters.
Right. Normally it's 7 monsters that people would say, right?
But the Wolfman is not the first universal werewolf movie. It's Werewolf of London.
Right. That's usually, by the way, Werewolf of London, when you see these lists, usually it's Werewolf of London that gets on the list. Ours isn't. It's the other one, because I felt it was maybe better known, because, of course, it's Lon Chaney, right? Which we should talk about Lon Chaney a little bit.
Lon Chaney Jr. And he's the Wolfman in all of them,
right?
And he became the replacement when Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi were busy, right? Because he's also the Mummy. And
I was going to say he's like a whack-a-mole. He keeps popping up in all the movies of those years.
Son of Dracula too. I think the Wolfman's probably better known than Werewolf of London, right?
Yeah, that was what I was getting at, right? Or I would say because for most people, and we're coming to this because this is going to tie into art, we tend to remember sort of iconic images. And in this case, it's the faces, and in many cases, the makeup effects of a couple of key players. Like, it's really just a handful of guys. And go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I'd say most people, when they imagine it, they're probably imagining 1941 Wolfman.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, you're talking about iconic images. That final transformation scene, when at the end, right, when he's changing back from the Wolfman to Lon Chaney,
to the human, right?
Yeah, nowadays we could see that and know how it's done,
right?
It's overlapping film,
sure.
But at the time, like, that was like
it holds up pretty well. It holds up pretty well.
Right? It still looks good.
It's funny. Again, it's going to be 90 years ago.
Yeah.
So that shows you how advanced it was for its time.
Oh yeah. And I think that's part of the reason the Wolfman kind of overshadows the Werewolf of London series, because there's 2 Werewolf of London movies.
Right.
Because the Werewolf of London, I think it's better shot, honestly. And the sets are better, but the Wolfman has that iconic scene at the end, and that's what sticks in people's heads.
The transformation, sure.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm glad you brought it up, Jonathan, because, when you talk about the directing in some of these movies, let's tie into that a little bit. I love black and white art, and I know you love black and white art, and we both have various, excuse me, we both have various degrees of projects that we're working on that features black and white art. And it's always interesting. I like to hear about some of people's influences. And, when we talk about the directing styles and the iconic images, which granted, that's part of this equation too, our number 7 comes out pretty large on the list, and that most people could remember this monster or some variation of them. It's number 7, The Phantom of the Opera.
Yeah.
So, that one has a very vivid directing style. What's your 2 cents worth on the Phantom?
So when I was looking at your list, I was kind of I was taken a little back by it, because I was like, Phantom of the Opera, because I haven't seen that in years. But it's the only one in color, right?
Well, there's 2 now.
Right. So
viewers at home, you got to remember something. We're total nerds, and we really get into this kind of stuff. For the purposes of the list, I was thinking it would be the 1925 version.
Okay.
And the reason why that's the one where he peels the mask.
Yeah.
That one has the image that people would know, but it doesn't have the full story that people would know. And I would also probably include right here, are you a Broadway person at all? Because if you were, somebody's got to mention, hey, Phantom of the Opera is this lavish and sumptuous, gorgeous musical, and it is that cool thing too.
So very different from the
so
from like the Lon Chaney or the Dario Argento
right. So there's many cool things about the Phantom, but what I want to ask you about, Jonathan, is, you know, for the directing style of, you know, what was a limited color palette, right, and the cool iconic scene. What's your thoughts on the directing style of those early films?
So we're talking about the silent, the 1925 Phantom of the Opera.
Right, and any other ones you want to bring in too, as long as it has a cool scene.
So the 1925 Phantom of the Opera, I think, is one of the, I think there's 3 silent films, you know, that have withstood the test of time, that even, like, you know, the most layman film goer knows about, right? Because they have such beautiful, iconic imagery. It's Metropolis, right? The Phantom of the Opera. And I'm forgetting my third one. I had a third one that I know everyone knows. Oh, Nosferatu, right? Nosferatu.
Sure. Right. Great picks, by the way. Metropolis is on our other list of the. We made a list of the top sci-fi titles that were not Star Wars, because otherwise you get a list with nothing but Star Wars on it.
Metropolis is actually interesting because of a bunch of the people who made Universal Horror, the kind of behind the scenes people, the cinematographers, the set builders, the directors, the writers, a lot of them came from Germany, right? Because, you know, this is the 30s. People are leaving Germany for obvious reasons.
Okay, I get it.
So a ton of those movies, especially the Universal movies, the cinematographers are people from Germany who worked on movies like Metropolis or The Golem or M. And they when they came to Hollywood, they ended up in 2 places. They ended up in horror, or they ended up in kind of gangster, hard-boiled.
Right.
And that became film noir, right? Yeah. So yeah, there's a through line from you know, the German expressionist horror all the way down to 1950s American horror.
Yeah, listen, I would buy that, especially when you think about the angles and the cinematography and the black and white art. Yeah.
And there's a movie coming up on your list that has a lot of that to talk about. So I won't talk about that anymore right now.
Well, you know, go ahead. Finish your thought.
So the original Phantom of the Opera is very interesting because a lot of people consider it the first Universal horror movie.
Right.
Because not so much because of the original release, although the original release is stunning, and it has some really good color effects, right? It uses, you know, they used strip Technicolor, right? And back in the day of early silent films, they could only use like 1 or 2 colors. I think the Phantom uses a 3-strip process, which means it still has kind of vivid color that looks good today, right? And then by the time you get to like Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz, they're using 7 strips, right?
Right, sure.
So the Phantom holds up visually in that regard because it was, you know, really state-of-the-art film techniques for 1925. But what really cemented it as being popular was in 1930, they released a sound version of the original film.
Right. And that, in my memory, that's the one that probably a lot of us remember. And even if you haven't seen the whole thing, it's like clips that you've picked up through here.
Right. Well, so no one's seen the whole thing because it was lost, unfortunately. Right. The dubbed sound version was lost in a fire in 1948. And then Universal remade it with Claude Rains, and that one was a little disappointing, I think.
Well, yeah, and the 25 version is that's Lon Chaney Sr., right?
Yeah, that's the pinnacle.
Right, he's the man of 1,000 faces, right?
Yeah,
and he's the one. His makeup effects, like he has this like tape holding his face back to make him look more grotesque.
Oh yeah, and he came up with all that on his own.
I know.
He was brilliant.
That's super clever.
So Lon Chaney also he did what Bela Lugosi would eventually do. He left Universal for MGM, and that's kind of a theme. Universal loses a lot of horror actors and a lot of horror franchises to MGM, just throughout constantly, like every decade it seems to happen.
Right.
And Lon Chaney kind of started that. So after
Interesting.
after Phantom, he did London After Midnight,
Right. Right.
which
Yep. Yep.
is
That's a different
unfortunately
film.
another lost film, but that was with MGM. That wasn't with and then ironically, Bela Lugosi did the exact same thing with a remake of London After Midnight, which is also directed by the guy who directed Dracula, Todd Browning.
Yeah, let's focus on that a little bit, because what you'll notice as we move through this list, these are all kind of the titans of the industry, right?
Yeah.
And they keep popping up here and there. So
Yeah.
here's Claude Rains again. He shows up on number 6 in 1933's The Invisible Man.
Yeah, great one.
Claude Rains was in a bunch of these films.
Oh yeah, Claude Rains was all over the place. Yeah. He has to probably be like one of the most prominent actors of that era, because he just pops up in everything. It doesn't matter the genre. It could be a musical, it could be a romantic comedy, right? I mean, he's in Casablanca, right?
Right.
He's he's all over the place. My guess is he was probably like a really likable guy, and people just really loved working with him. But he had 2 starring roles in the Universals, right? He was the Invisible Man, and he was the Phantom, and then he has a ton of like, supporting roles, right? I think he's in Son of Frankenstein and Ghost of Frankenstein.
Yeah,
and
when
the
you
Wolfman,
go through these lists,
yeah,
his name turns up again and again.
all the time. Yeah, all the time. So the Invisible Man is kind of the titan of Universal horror. That's James Whale directed it, right? James Whale directed Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, and a ton of movies. I mean, he had an incredible career. I think his first movie was in 1930, and his last movie, let's see, was in 1941. And in those 11 years, he directed 21 movies. That's just insane.
2
That's
movies
ridiculous.
a year,
yeah. You would never. I mean, there's no director equivalent of that now.
Well, and I like to make the point. We talk about some of these Universal monsters, and we all have our favorites, right?
Mm-hmm.
But some of them have gone on to very successful franchises, right? And there's honestly so many movies that you could talk about, Jonathan. But for today, I want to talk about the directing and the kind of the black and white stuff like you and I really like. But I mean, the potential of the franchises became huge, and this is an example. Number 5, Dracula.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of a myth about Dracula that I don't think is true. I don't have any like authority to say it's not true. But people said that the director, Todd Browning, ruined his career with a later movie called Freaks.
Freaks, right? I knew this is you're headed toward Freaks. Yeah. What a disturbing movie. Yeah. Okay. Keep going.
But I think he ruined his career with Dracula. Because what happened with Dracula is he ran out of budget like 3 months into the movie. There's ever since Dracula, no one would be willing to give him a budget, and then he ended his career on Freaks, which had like no budget whatsoever.
Right.
So I think what started the end of his career was Dracula.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much of that was his fault, because I don't know if you know about Spanish Dracula.
I don't.
So basically, Universal had him make 2 movies at the same time. Right? They had him make Dracula, and then they had to make the same movie in Spanish with different actors.
Sure, I'm aware that was a practice back then.
So, and actually, a lot of people prefer the Spanish Dracula because the Spanish Dracula was shot at night, right? They shot, the American Dracula during the day, and then Spanish Dracula at night. So a lot of people think the Spanish Dracula has more realistic atmospheric lighting.
That's kind of cool. Yeah.
But yeah, he ran out of budget about 3 months in. And I think it shows in the movie too. Like if you watch that movie, all the scenes in Transylvania are amazing, right? it's so moody, it's so gothic,
it's very moody
so
and very
creepy.
gothic. Yeah, that's one thing that I think they started to change right about then was, well, you mentioned Nosferatu earlier. So I think most Americans were probably, when they thought vampire, they thought of Nosferatu. And the first Dracula with Bela Lugosi was the one that it sort of reaffirmed the version that was Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Yeah.
Meaning that he was kind of sexy, he was a count, he had powers of persuasion, that kind of thing. He was less monstrous and more powered, I guess you'd say.
Yeah. Yeah, he's suave, and he is in the book too. He is in the book too.
Right. Yeah, and the book, like I say, is kind of almost well, and not to get too far off the list, but I'll also quick touch on, this Francis Ford Coppola's version. I like that version a lot, and that's it emphasizes the Bram Stoker elements of romance because that stuff is in the book.
Oh yeah. I mean, so Bram Stoker was best friends with Le Fanu, who wrote Carmilla, right?
Oh, I didn't know that.
And they were, they were collaborating all the time, right? And so Le Fanu that's the epitome of romantic vampires, right? So that is obviously part of Bram Stoker's work, and a lot of people kind of try to say, "Oh no, he's scary vampires." It's like, no, not really. He's trying to make his vampires sexy too, right? And
maybe that's one of the secrets to the longevity of the Dracula stories, is that people
absolutely,
stories that are a little sexy, kind of. How about, were you again, not to go too far off, but were you a Salem's Lot fan? Do you remember Salem's Lot, the 1970s Stephen King miniseries about where the vampires are taking over the main town? I guess where I'm going with this is that the vampire legends continue to prosper and continue. And the reason why, I think, is because these first ones were so good.
Oh yeah. Dracula, Nosferatu, just incredible movies. The Dracula movies were kind of anomalous within the Universal canon, because there's really not that many of them, and Bela Lugosi never reprised his role as Dracula.
Right. Now, and some of the other movies are great, of course, and some of them, there's varying degrees of quality. We always say, hey, viewers, man, go check them out for yourself. That's part of the fun, is maybe to discover something you hadn't seen. But the franchises that grew from this were incredibly strong.
Oh yeah.
We're chatting about Dracula, of course. The next one, and he's going to really appear on the list really 3 times, but it's going to make sense as we go forward, because he's one of the most well-known Universal monsters. Number 4, Son of Frankenstein.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead, take this one.
This is the one I was referring to when I was talking about German Expressionism.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And again, we talk about this black and white cinematography. When it's done well, some of these movies have these classic, iconic scenes, which it's almost like looking at an old woodcut.
Yeah. Looking at old woodcut, looking at old lithograph. They really capture that gothic horror feel. And something I always like to talk about when talking about Son of Frankenstein. Well, there's 2 things, right? If you ever watch any Tim Burton movie, like before Big Fish, right?
Yeah, I do.
There's 3 movies that he just like takes from all the time, right? Like you just see that it's like, that's from Son of Frankenstein, that's from Son of Frankenstein. So the big one's Son of Frankenstein.
He's got a scene also that is, I've got to mention this. It's exactly what you just said.
Yeah.
In his movie Sleepy Hollow.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It is the homage scene of the burning windmill from, I think that one's actually in Frankenstein 1.
Yeah, that's the first Frankenstein.
Yeah. So I'll save that. We'll come back to it. But yeah, he does reference the homages pretty heavy.
Yeah. In that very same movie, Sleepy Hollow, there's a ton of references to Die Blungenoid, which is a Fritz Lang movie, who like hit all the cinematographers and set designers working on that movie ended up at Universal.
That a lot of people didn't love the Tim Burton version of Sleepy Hollow. I loved it. It's one of my favorite movies.
And I like it up until the end.
You know, one of my favorite
I don't like the
things,
chase scene. Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, Christopher Walken. I'm always
Oh
predisposed
yeah.
to like it,
Christopher Walken is
but I
made
like
that.
The theme song. Of course, I'm a Danny Elfman
Oh yeah.
to begin with, and you know we're songwriters over here, so we pattern our songs a little bit. The song for our new book, Call of the Cryptid, is going to have a 1950s theme song where the guy's playing a theremin to have that weird spacey sound.
Nice.
And the melody, it's very similar to Sleepy Hollow. Like it's spooky, you know, spooky and driving. Like, and you know, sometimes we do that when you make these reels of making the songs. It's much like when you're directing the scene, you know, make it sound like this, you know.
Yeah, I'm a huge Oingo Boingo fan from like
No
way
way.
back. So yeah.
yeah, man. Hey, you're going back some years now.
Yeah.
And hey, we could make a whole list about these soundtracks of
horror
movies. Yeah, because there's so many great iconic ones on that. You know, people are going to yell at us though if we don't talk about this next entry, because any entry of the Universal monsters has to include the creature from the Black Lagoon.
Yeah.
That's number 3. And we can talk about a couple of his movies. I would make a quick comment that he really is the one, because of his cool design, stimulated sci-fi.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, more so than, I mean, it was a horror movie, I get that, but I would definitely say he stimulated the sci-fi people and made it cool to be a monster.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you say that, because you know, he's the last Universal monster movie.
Yeah, and by the way, these went into that's 1954.
Yeah, that's 1954.
And, you know, listen, I almost cut him off the list because of that.
Yeah.
You know, because we have another one coming up, and it's sci-fi movies of the 50s. They're kind of like divided by the years. But the creature went longer years than the.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people also, they don't realize, you know, they might marathon the Universal movies, but they don't realize, you know, that's a long time between Dracula in 1931 and the creature from the Black Lagoon, right? That's you know, that's like 20 years, something like that.
Right. And not really too many similarities between these films, and even the only way they're connected is by Universal.
And actually, I would say the creature, you know, they always say it's Beauty and the Beast, right? But I think it's King Kong. The creature's basically a remake of King Kong.
Sure.
Which is interesting because the third or fourth Mummy movie is kind of also a remake of King Kong. I've always suspected that the creature began life as a Mummy movie. Because the last Mummy movie takes place in a bayou, right? And the mummy comes out of the swamp. And I think at some point, you know, they decided that it's going to be a new creature, right? Because they were trying to compete with the sci-fi stuff, right? They're trying to compete with the William Castle stuff.
Yep, which was just starting to gain some traction.
Yeah. And so if you watch the creature, it feels much more like a William Castle movie than it does a Universal movie.
In what way? Give us an example or two.
So it's in 3D for one, right?
Oh, that's
the
right.
original release is in 3D.
I had forgotten that.
It starts with that narration, right? Like, in the beginning, you know, man walked on, and there's all those 3D effects, you know, to make you feel like you spent your money wisely buying those 3D glasses, right? But they're really only at the beginning of the movie, which is a very William Castle thing. So yeah, in a lot of ways, I feel like the creature feels very 50s, right?
Yeah.
It's spawned a lot of stars, right? Clint Eastwood's in the second one, which is crazy.
Right.
And isn't it Julie Andrews in the first one?
I think it is.
Yeah, Mary Poppins.
Viewers will correct us if we got that one wrong.
Yeah.
You know, like you say, there was kind of a leap that took place between those years, and it was the leap from Universal monster horrordom to the dawn of 50s sci-fi. And we have that coming up on our next list. And boy, I'd love to get your opinion on some of those too. And you know, when we talk about these franchises, how they've lived on, some of it is because of things like the creature that had this really cool, really iconic design.
Oh, he's such a cool looking monster. He looks so good.
And I got to tell you one thing, I've always been hooked on water monsters and swamp monsters, anything like that. But when it came to iconic designs, there weren't too many more iconic than our number 2. She was the Bride of Frankenstein.
Oh yeah.
That's one, man. This I almost had this for my number 1 because it might even be my favorite.
It is my favorite personally.
Is it okay? Well, we'll call this a flip-flop then.
So James Whale's again, right? Who directed The Invisible Man. This is a special effects masterpiece for its era, for now. Like I back in school I studied concept art for movies, right?
Did you?
So I've talked to a lot of special effects people, and I always ask them, like, when I find out they like old horror movies, like, how did they do that one scene in Bride of Frankenstein? And it's the scene everyone talks about with Pretorius and the people in the jars, right?
Yeah.
Because it's so seamless. Like, I have no idea how he did it, and I know industry special effects people now don't know how they made it so seamless back then. It looks real, and considering this is what, 1934 or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's 34.
How did they do that? Like, I don't know, and most people don't seem to know. It's some kind of movie magic that no one's figured out.
And here, and again, some of this has to do with, we talked about that crisp design for the Bride, which is just, here it is, we remember it this many years later. But I was going to say the scenes are also very well acted. There's a lot of emotion in it. It's very you can tell you're seeing movie stars, put it that way, at the top of their game. And it's, here we are talking about it, dude. It's 90 years later. And
I know.
Right. And my point is, there's very few movies that would have us doing that. And it's definitely the case with these Frankenstein movies. Now, we mentioned you and I might have flipped number 2 and number 1. So the way I have it right now, I will just introduce it as it's our number 1, which is Frankenstein, the OG. And the reason why I picked it, we were saying earlier, we both love black and white art and these simple yet classic renderings that are really the signatures of these types of movies. In my case, it was the burning windmill scene from Frankenstein, which is also, of course, the homage in Sleepy Hollow by Tim Burton.
There's a lot of Universal movies that end with villagers burning a building, but Frankenstein is what started it, right?
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this question, the $1 million question, Jonathan. Mm-hmm. In your mind, why are these images so revered and so well remembered almost 100 years later?
It's good craftsmen, right? These people knew how to design a shot, and they also had a lot of life experience to draw from, right? Most of these guys were World War I vets. A lot of them were immigrants from countries that have been taken over, right? So they've kind of seen horrors that are similar to this, right? There's that famous story. I don't know how true it is, but James Whale, the director, became obsessed with the concept of necrophilia early on because he was gay, and his lover in World War I was killed and stuck on the barbed wire. So he would see him every day in the trenches. And he translated that to this kind of, what it was Frankenstein's favorite line, living bad, dead good, right? To this love of the dead in Frankenstein.
It's heavy, man.
Yeah, those images had weight for these people. And they kind of, they're not really exploring the horror of it, because these movies aren't scary to us now. But there's kind of a psychic, like a psychic terror in there that's coming from their own real life experiences. And we don't see that with directors now.
I would totally buy that, Jonathan. And I tell you, that reminds me of a story I heard once about, well, first, I agree with you in the sense that these guys had seen these unspeakable horrors in the war, and then here they come back and they're making movie sets, right?
Yeah.
But in some of these other movies, they have things like this is fast forward quite a number of years. It's Batman 1989, who Anton Furst was the set director.
Oh, so good. So good.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. Yeah. And he had some I want to say this gently, he had mental health issues.
Yeah, manic depressive.
Yeah, he ended up taking his own life.
Yeah, it was very sad.
But you look at his work, it's incredible. And you can feel you can feel the pain in the setting that he created. And I think that some of that's true with what we're saying here about the guys in Frankenstein. And out of the other examples that you gave too, this one would definitely have ties to the German expressionism.
Oh yeah. You know, they all do. It was you know, Edgar Ulmer, who's the other big cinematographer? Well, so there was a lot of cinematographers and directors who worked on these movies. One thing though, I kind of want to mention before we wrap up, one of my favorite Universal movies that doesn't often get mentioned because it's not it doesn't get mentioned in the canon of Universal. Island of Lost Souls.
Oh yeah. Now hold on a second. Why would it not? It is in the canon, isn't it? Or
no? So it's I mean, what most people consider the canon is those 7 monsters.
The 7, right.
But you know, Island of Lost Souls has Bela Lugosi.
Right. And thematic elements.
Yeah. And it's Moreau is the Bride of Frankenstein's husband, also Lancaster's husband, Charles Lawton.
Hey man, we can count that. If we can count White Zombie, we can count Island of Lost Souls.
But part of the reason I want to mention Island of Lost Souls is because there's another Lugosi rumor, right? That he didn't want to wear makeup for Dracula, and that kind of typecasted him in his career. And I don't think that's true, because Island of Lost Souls came out around the same time as Dracula, and he's wearing makeup. He's wearing full-on monster makeup. So I think that's just kind of a false rumor that he was difficult to work with in that regard.
Interesting. Yeah, I love to hear these stories about these, like we were saying, they're titans of the industry. In those days, if you were in one of these films, you were at the top of your craft. And I just want to say first, Jonathan, I really appreciate you taking the time to help me with this list. It was kind of a hard one because there's a lot of information out there about the Universal monsters, but we like to talk about kind of specific things that we love, right? And that's kind of the theme of our show. And in our case, I'm a huge fan of black and white art, and I know Jonathan is too. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about your art, and I'm going to share some graphics here with the viewers. Can you tell us, Jonathan, what first of all, what are you primarily known for? And second, what are your influences?
So I primarily work with Black Dragon Comics, and they do the series Vestige and Bullet Maker. And I've only worked on Bullet Maker. Vestige is a guy named Doodles. That's not his real name, obviously, but he's very good. And then we have a new series coming out soon that's already been crowdfunded called Crash the System. Cool. And then we have a board game also coming out, which I don't know how much I'm allowed to talk about it, but there is some like kind of a tabletop royalty that worked on that with us.
Oh, nice.
So that should be very interesting when it comes out. And I did a 12-page story for that, and I think like 50 character designs. Wow. So that'll be cool when it comes out. And then I have my own comic that I'm working on separately, which is kind of a very, I would call it a very postmodern sci-fi comic. And I'll be launching that at some point in the future. Okay. But if you're interested in Black Dragon Comics, you could just check out their Indiegogo page. Just search for Indiegogo Black Dragon Comics.
And I'll get some, when we go to air, I'll get the links for you, and we'll have the links in the description for the folks that would like to follow it. And I definitely will check it out. I have seen some of your art portfolio online. And the thing that struck me, Jonathan, first off, I dig your work, and it reminded me in the best way. It has sort of like a classic sensibility with like almost sort of like a Steranko, Wally Wood. Again, you have the influences of some Titans in there. Am I correct?
Oh yeah, Wally Wood is my favorite. So you hit the nail on the head there. Yeah. I definitely look at his work a lot. Big fan of Steranko. Yeah, I would say in terms of my classic influences, it's Bollywood, Gene Colan.
Oh, right. Yeah, I get that, man. I get that.
And Nick Cardy. And so
Sure,
those are
okay.
my three big.
Gotcha.
That's my trinity right there.
And do you mind if I ask you, for your illustration and comics training, did you go to any kind of class, or did you, Kubert school? What does the road look like for Jonathan?
I was pretty kind of discouraged at a young age from pursuing art as a career. So I didn't start pursuing it until kind of later in life, right? I worked in corporate sales for most of my 20s, and then decided to go back to art school in my late 20s. And I went to the San Jose State animation illustration program.
Oh, nice. Okay.
And they're referred to as shrunken headmen. They have a lot of people that are in Pixar and Blue Sky and Acclaim, the video game publisher Acclaim. So what I studied was animation and concept art mainly. But I always had it in the back of my head. It's like, I don't really want to do this. I want to do comics.
Right.
Because it's very corporate, working on video games, working on movies now.
Let me ask you this question. This will tie into it. I will say that, well, you're a talented guy. You can do a lot of things, obviously. You got sales background. Why comics? Why would you do comics?
Because I know, a lot of people laugh at this when I tell them, I think comics are the purest art form, right? Some people say painting is the purest art form. Some people say film. Some people say animation. I think it's comics, because it's the perfect mix of writing and art. And you could also keep that production team small, right? You could make an epic comic with just one person. You can't make an epic movie with just one person, right? You can't make an epic video game with just one person. And I think the more people you have on something, the more kind of diluted the idea becomes often.
That's a good answer. There is also something, because I'm a comic maker too, right? And there's something, once you start to learn the craft of it, and what I mean by the craft, like the making of a page is different than a script. It's different than a song. There's something in making a page to express a beat visually that you get you get hooked on it almost.
Yeah.
And once you start doing it, it's kind of hard to go back to anything else. So, and we write songs and stuff too. So it is, I always say, if you're the leader of a band or something, or you're the singer, you probably have the skills to run a comic team, because it's very similar.
Yeah,
it's very similar. Like I say, it's like being in your little band. But Jonathan, thanks for sharing your expertise on this subject, and also thanks for telling us about your art. I've been following it, and I think it looks terrific. So if the viewers want to follow that, I'll put the links in the comments below us. Do you have anything coming up that you want to promote?
No, I think it's going to be a minute for the next release. Bullet Maker 2 is probably going to be the next release. And if you're curious about that, just keep up with the Indiegogo page, and you'll see it pop up there eventually.
Perfect. And I'll just shoot out a quick plug for my new book, which one of the reasons we bring this up is we are doing for the first time an all black and white edition.
Oh,
was just to sort of give you the feel of one of the old Warren magazines or Curtis publications, the black and white horror magazines of the 70s. So that's titled Call of the Cryptid. That's in pre-launch right now over on Kickstarter. So I hope you guys will give it a follow. So to the viewers, thanks for tuning in. This has been an episode of Holden's 11. I hope you enjoyed the evening. I had a great time talking to Jonathan. Thanks again, Jonathan. I appreciate you coming on the show. Good night, everybody.